Okay. Well, thanks everyone for coming out. Thanks for your patience while we sorted out some minor technical details. But now we're all ready to go. So I'm Dan Slater. I'm the director of the Center for Emerging Democracies. This is our second roundtable of the year. We had one on democracy at the university a couple of weeks ago, which some of you were at. Good to see people returning. And so the idea today is to do a panel based and kind of inspired by and built around the book that you see before you, Unequal Democracies, which has been published recently. And, so we're going to get a sense of the book and some of its contents today. Obviously, the combination of democracy and inequality is one of the biggest questions of our time. So I'm glad we'll be tackling it today. Given a little bit of a late start, so let me just try to just really briefly introduce our panelists. So Noam Lupu, we're very happy to be here with us today from Vanderbilt University. He's the director of the newly established Center for Global Democracy at Vanderbilt, and Noam is one of the co-editors, along with Jonas Ponsen of this fine volume. So he'll be speaking first, giving us a sense of the whole. And Charlotte Cavaille is sitting to Noam's immediate right. Charlotte is a professor in the Ford School, and also, I think, by courtesy in the political science department. Right, we're very courteous. So, by courtesy in political science as well, Charlotte is one of the chapter authors in the volume. And really, the brainchild for this whole event really is credit to Vincent Mauro, to my immediate left. Vincent is a postdoctoral fellow in the Center for Emerging Democracies now. Vincent got his PhD from Cornell University and works on democracy and inequality primarily in Latin America. So I think it's going to be very interesting to get some perspectives from Europe, Latin America, perhaps globally, and from everybody in the room as well. So thanks again to everyone for coming out. Noam, whenever you're ready, go ahead and start and kick us off.
Okay. Thanks. Thanks, Dan, for organizing this, and Vincent for the idea and the invitation. It's this book project started right before the pandemic, and then sort of took shape during the pandemic. So it's nice to be able to do some in-person things around these things. So thanks everybody for coming. I thought I would kind of give a sense of the overall kind of project that this volume is engaged in, and kind of lay out essentially the way that we lay out the introduction to the volume, and how we kind of frame the research question. And I'll give a sense of some of the themes that come up in the individual chapters, but we can also talk more if there are questions about some of those chapters, and you'll hear at least about Charlotte's contribution. So the kind of motivating question of this volume is what Jonas and I have called the political puzzle of rising inequality. And I think the way that often among political scientists and political economists gets framed is essentially like this. So this is a set of figures from the introduction. And of course, there's lots of discussion about how we measure economic inequality or inequality more generally. And these are a couple of options in kind of measuring income inequality among the more affluent democracies in sort of North America and Western Europe and Australia. And you see sort of, a segment, a couple handfuls of the countries that we might look at in this period. And basically, what you're looking at, there's some variation across countries, and, we can certainly talk more about that variation. But essentially what you're seeing is that since the 1990s, inequality kind of, regardless of how we measure it overall, has on average increased in across these countries. And what I think is notable about these figures are kind of two things that we can certainly come back to. One is that the US is not at the top. The US is not the case where inequality has risen the most since the 1990s, though it certainly is among those that started more unequal at the beginning of the, before the 1990s. The other is that if you look at the sort of individual countries here, the Scandinavian countries are at the high end. So the countries that sort of used to be considered the most egalitarian also sort of experienced the highest increases in inequality. And so a lot of research in political science and political economy that focuses on these questions has sort of asked, well, how do we reconcile kind of rising inequality in these sort of well-functioning electoral democracies? Why have governments not compensated citizens for rising inequality? And that kind of formulation, this idea of sort of compensatory redistribution to address rising inequality, kind of presupposes or sort of implicitly assumes that what's happening here is that there's kind of economies are creating increasing inequality, globalization, or whatever sort of external kind of market forces are creating inequality. And governments have to sort of respond to this by compensating citizens, by sort of increasing redistribution or something like that. One of the things that we try to point out that we think is a puzzle. So, that's sort of one way to frame this puzzle. I think that one of the things that we tried to do in the introduction is to also point out that that's only one way to frame this puzzle. And that a really important piece of this puzzle that's often overlooked is that not only have governments not responded to rising market inequality, but in fact, governments increased inequality. Right? So if you look at this, and there's sort of a lot of numbers here, but basically, if you sort of look at the rightmost column here, this is sort of comparing changes in market inequality and changes in disposable inequality, which is after sort of the majority of government intervention, like redistributive transfers and taxes and things like that. So the change in the redistributive effect of government policy, at least in terms of taxes and transfers, is on the whole negative over this period, which is governments have reduced the amount of redistribution that they engage in, right? So rising inequality is not just kind of a market phenomenon that's been happening across these countries since the 1990s. It's actually a combination of that and governments actually deciding to retrench from redistribution. Okay, so the kind of motivation of the volume is to try to understand, why this is happening or why this has happened. So there's sort of different possibilities in how we think about explaining this, and the volume is kind of organized into kind of categories of explanations, which for the most part have not engaged in sort of direct dialogue with each other. And that was one of the motivations for putting this volume together. There's a subset of work that has really focused on elites and the decisions that political elites are making, and kind of the degree to which elites represent the preferences or the interests, depending on how you come at it, of voters. So there's a line of research that has shown that governments, starting with the United States, and then a number of other cases, and a chapter in the volume that looks at responsiveness to different classes of citizens. And one of the sort of main findings of that research is that governments tend to respond to the preferences of affluent citizens, right? And so governments are retrenching from redistribution and or not responding to rising inequality because they sort of cater to the preferences of rich voters who don't want more redistribution. Right? So that's one possible explanation. Another is that political parties, and particularly interest groups, are sort of playing a role in reducing the potential responsiveness of the political system more generally, or representative elites. And there's a couple of chapters that focus on that, particularly focused on the case of the US and the role of interest groups in the US. Another possibility, and there's kind of been a growing literature in political science on the economic backgrounds of politicians. Nick Carnes and I have a chapter in the volume where we look at this. One thing that has become clear through our own research and lots of other work is that elected officials, these elites who are supposed to be responding, or we would expect them to respond to the preferences of voters or citizens, are themselves generally very affluent. And that has implications for kind of who they respond to or what kinds of policies they pursue. And there is some change over time. I think there's sort of less historical data on the economic backgrounds of politicians, but it's certainly the case that in a number of West European cases where we do have data, working class politicians, there used to be more working class politicians in particularly leftist, center-left parties in Western Europe, and that has declined over time. So that's another possible explanation for this phenomenon of retrenchment and rising inequality. And finally, there's a chapter in the volume that looks at unequal participation, right? So we know, particularly in affluent countries, that within those countries, more affluent people are more likely to participate in politics, not just to turn out to vote, but participate more actively, call representatives, sign petitions, all the other non-electoral forms of participation. And so if elites are responding to the people that they hear from, right, and the people that they hear from are the people who are less supportive of redistributive economic policies, then there might be something, they might be responding to a constituency, but it might not be the constituency that prefers redistribution. So that's sort of the set of chapters that focuses on elites. And then we have a set of chapters that focus on voters, right, or citizens. So maybe there is not the kind of demand for redistribution that we would expect in contexts of rising inequality, or that our kind of theories and models of democracy would expect. So one of the chapters looks at the role of media in shaping opinions, particularly with regard to economic outcomes. And the chapter really focuses on, and it's part of a larger project, really focuses on economic performance indicators and the kinds of things that get media coverage. And so over time, there's a change in media coverage in a number of countries, certainly in the US, but they also look at a couple of other of these kind of affluent democracies. Stock market outcomes get more media coverage than employment outcomes, right? So the kind, and certainly more coverage than inequality, right? So the kinds of things that might drive redistribution are getting less covered and potentially shaping the way that citizens think about, good economic performance versus bad economic performance. Even citizens who don't have, savings in the stock market might think that the economy is doing well because the stock market is going up, even though unemployment might also be going up. Okay, I'm not going to say too much about differing fairness norms because Charlotte's going to talk about her chapter, which is part of her really excellent book on demand for redistribution and how fairness norms kind of shape people's demand for redistribution. There's a chapter that also looks at the kind of intersection between class and race, and particularly in the context of the US, and sort of brings in the question of trust in government, right? So rising inequality, we might expect that rising inequality would generate more demand for redistribution, but that sort of presupposes that how people respond to rising inequality is to say, I want government to do more, to compensate for rising inequality. And that requires that sort of your reaction to observing inequality is that you want more government involvement in the economic sphere. So that requires some trust in government. There are obviously some, the possibility that the way that people think about the role of government might be different, might have changed over time, and might be different depending on sort of their perception, their race, or their perception of the sort of racial composition of people who might benefit from redistribution, right? So there's a really nice chapter in the volume by Kathy Kramer, who listens to, again, this was during the pandemic, and she's done a lot of kind of ethnographic fieldwork, particularly in Wisconsin. But here during the pandemic, she listened to call-in radio talk shows in Wisconsin, sort of local radio shows. And she sort of analyzes how people talk about the issue of redistribution and the George Floyd murder, and sort of how they, and during the pandemic, the sort of role of government and how they sort of make sense of these things, both conservative call-in shows and more liberal call-in shows, and really sort of, I think, documents very nicely the way that race kind of undercuts efforts to build sort of a cross-race class coalition in favor of redistribution, at least in the US. And then finally, there's a nice chapter on perceptions of representation and how all of this, and I think part of the motivation of, why any of us care about this kind of puzzle of rising inequality and unequal representation is partly because we all, I think, perceive these issues as fomenting the kind of populism that we just had a conversation about, the kind of perceptions of a lack of representation that feeds into some of the politics that we've seen in the last decade and a half. So there's a chapter that tries to sort of bring that into this conversation and sort of documents how working class people in the European context view the political parties and their responsiveness and the degree to which they feel represented by the parties and the political system. So those are, the variety of explanations that are in the volume trying to, make sense of this this larger puzzle. There isn't, and we have been critiqued for, not having a concluding chapter, which, I think is less a sort of, semantic thing, but actually, it's sort of a critique that there isn't one answer that we are kind of offering to this question. We didn't view the sort of exercise as kind of, forcing the individual authors into some sort of particular, unified theoretical framework. We really wanted to sort of bring all of these perspectives together and have them start to interact with each other in ways that hasn't been happening. So, it is a variety of explanations, I think some of which turn out to, do a better job of explaining the phenomenon than others. And we can talk about those, but it really was an effort to sort of bring together this kind of isolated group of people working on unequal representation and a different group of people working on economic inequality and the politics of redistribution, and try to see what we could kind of learn from each other and how our arguments might complement each other. The other thing that, we tried to do, and I think maybe less successfully than the first, is to bring work on the US into comparative perspective. The US is a case that should be treated as a case and not an exception, some sort of, exceptional case. Here I think the sort of authors that contributed to the volume came away, I think, with some differences of opinion about whether the US is truly an exception or whether it makes sense to compare the US and Denmark. But, we can continue to have those conversations. As I said, the sort of purpose is to offer some new explanations and future directions. And I think, we try to do that in the introduction, but not necessarily to come down on kind of a particular, like, this is the one thing that's going on. And partly because I think there are lots of things going on here. I think there's some ongoing debate about among the chapters and among these explanations. And, we try to tease those out a little bit at the end of the introduction as well. And there are some methodological contributions that, I can certainly say more about, but that might be sort of, less interesting for a broader audience about kind of, how we measure inequality and how we measure government responsiveness and representation. And there's an entire really nice chapter by my colleague, Larry Bartels, on how we measure political inequality and has some critiques for, some of the efforts, the different people have, the sort of directions different people have taken. So that's kind of the overview. And looking forward to the broader conversation.
Yeah, so the book, as you might have figured out, has kind of two components. One is what do voters want in times of rising inequality, and to what extent institutions are able to translate these demands to actual policy. My contribution was what do voters want? We're good. I actually started wanting to write a dissertation about preference aggregation and elites, but I got down the rabbit hole of what voters want and never got out of it. So it was fun to be part of a volume that was more all-encompassing. I think for folks in the audience, if you're interested in these issues of how responsive a political system is, it's a really nice overview. Some of the chapters in there are really nice overview of the state of the debate. I don't know how many grad students in the room? Just so I can think. Okay, all right. So I won't talk about PhD topics then. So let's talk about what voters want. So how did I get interested in this question? It's the exact same motivating puzzle, and I think it's because I came of age under Jonas Pontuson's reign, the co-editor. So maybe that's right. And so the way to think about this is, I'm not sure if I do it that way. So I moved to the US at the time where Thomas Piketty was starting to dump really a lot of data. And so that's the data on the right, where it's plotting the share that goes to the top. So every year there's market income produced, and you try to see who gets what share. So here I'm plotting the top 10% on the right for the United States, and then the bottom 60%. So think about middle class below, and then the top 10% richest in a given year. And so these numbers were dropping, hot off the press. And you could see this really sharp trend. 10% in the US today get about 45% of market income. It was also the Great Recession. And it felt really painful economically for a lot of people. And so I wondered, why isn't the bottom trying harder to expropriate the top? Maybe revolution is coming to the United States. Remember, I'm coming from France. I get to the US, actually, maybe this is the place where, things are going to happen. I'm also happen to be British. And I knew the British data pretty well, that Tony Atkinson, an economist who actually passed away, kind of the mentor of Piketty, was also pouring. And even though if the levels are different, the trends are the same. Things are a little funkier in the UK since the Great Recession. And you might notice, they're in decline. So economic decline seems good for inequality in the UK case. But before, at least, you had similar trends in the United States. And so my gut reaction is, why are we not seeing stronger left-wing movements, given inequality, given the Great Recession? So I call it the missing left turn puzzle. In order to put kind of structure on an intuition, the set of models that try to flesh out what needs to be true for your intuition about there should be a missing left turn, Why is it not happening? Well, you don't follow an intuition. You try to build a model. And so there are these categories of models out there that assumes that they should do it because it's in their self-interest. As, here income is concentrated. It's in your self-interest to tax it, to fund public goods that you benefit from, or even to fund policies that are targeted to the majority, the bottom 60%, right? So that's the category of models I was working with. Of course, I know people are not just self-interested. Of course, I know people don't think about politics by looking at these graphs and thinking we're going to soak the rich and fund policies that benefit us. But it was a starting point to try to structure one's reasoning. And it's the starting point in the book to some extent. Let's take this starting point seriously. Let's assume that people think about redistribution from a self-interested perspective. And so under what condition do you think about redistribution, about policies that achieve some amount of redistribution in a way that is kind of through this lens of self-interest? Well, you need to know if this policy is going to benefit you. So you need to know if you're going to be affected and how. So is the policy going to benefit me? First of all, am I affected? And am I going to be affected in a positive way or not? Okay? And so when you start thinking about it that way, well, to assume that they're going to soak the rich because it's in the self-interest, this bottom 60%, you need to know that redistribution affects you, yes, and that you're going to be affected, not even hear about, I've kept it in pretty general terms, but you know for sure that if you're the bottom 60%, you're going to be potentially highly affected, or it's a fair amount, for you to even go through the effort of trying to, mobilize and lobby in order to get these policies passed. So you're basically in a world of certainty where you understand how policy affects you, and if it affects you a lot or not. Even most people who do a PhD in political science know that they don't really understand how they're affected by policy. We can talk about why. That's just the nature of representative democracy. Things take a long time to pan out. You can run a deficit. Politicians very strategically make sure you don't realize how you're going to be affected because they're concerned about backlash. And so most of the time, people can't really answer these questions. They don't really know if they're going to be affected. Some people, they might think they're going to be affected sometime in the future, but they can't even know exactly how much. So a kind of self-interested reaction to a change in the economy requires a lot of information. And so we're in this world. So in this world, it's not that people don't behave in a self-interested way, it's that they're not in an informational institutional context that kind of rewards that kind of behavior. So then I thought, how do you form preferences over redistributive policies when the consequences are uncertain for yourself? What other perspective are you taking? And so there, I call it fairness reasoning in the book, but let me just give you the intuition here. Well, what is redistribution? It's two main institutions. In practice, there are three, but I'm simplifying to two. So one is, what do you think about institutions that generate market income? So what do you think about what we call the data generation process behind the graphs that I just showed you at the beginning? Okay? Do you think it's fair or not? Do you think it's fair that the rich get more? Do you think they got it for the right reasons? Do you think that if you work hard enough, you will get a shot at this type of, economic success, versus folks who think, hell no, this data generation process is not fair. So I think of it as we are societies organized around norms of meritocracy, and some people think the system is meritocratic, and some people think that it isn't. And so if you think the system is meritocratic, you're less likely to want to tax market income. You're less supportive of certain types of redistributive policies that affect the distribution of market income inequality. But the other type of fairness that I think is important is, to what extent do you think social solidarity is done fairly? So what do I mean about that? So a lot of redistribution actually is done through something like Social Security in the US. We all pay into a system, and at some point we're going to draw from it. Except that some folks draw more than they contribute, maybe because they're more likely to be unemployed a longer time in their life, or the systems are a little progressive, so by design, you pay a little less if you're poor into Social Security than you get. The problem of life expectancy, that's another debate. So Social Security might not be the best example. But let's take universal healthcare in the UK. It's funded through progressive taxes, income taxes, and then you just draw based on need. Need for healthcare is stratified by class. So lower income folks kind of get more out of the NHS than they pay into it. That's actually the best way How do you decrease inequality? You make sure market income inequality from the start are not too large. So you have a version of capitalism that is not inherently egalitarian. And then you do a lot of social solidarity that happens to be redistributed. And people's perception of how fair social solidarity is, same idea, kind of differs. So some people think social solidarity works. It's helping the right type of people. And there's some other folks who think, no, it's going to the freeloaders, the free riders. I'm working so hard and I'm not getting as much as these immigrants, these women, like name your kind of scapegoat. That's another sense of unfairness. So here the norm is reciprocity. We're all helping each other out. As I'm cooperating. You help me when I need it. When you need it, I'm going to help you. And some people think it's unfair because the wrong people, the free riders, are being helped, and other people trust the system and thinks it works. This is the type of concerns that people bring to the table when they think about redistribution in a highly uncertain context. Now, I think it's the shortest way to use this book and put in press. So now let me basically...
We're all extremely...
Let me try to explain to you by comparing countries. So here what I've done is I've ranked. Don't look at the axis. There's a bit more conceptual work to go to be able to read them on your own. But basically the y-axis ranks countries from to what extent do they think markets are unfair to the extent to which they think markets are fair. That's how you should think about this. And then the x-axis, it's ranking countries from to what extent do they think there's no problem with free riding, high trust and social solidarity, and to what extent they think there's a lot of freeloaders. Well, look at the US. They think markets are fair and they think there are a lot of freeloaders. Okay? To my surprise, the exact opposite is actually Latvia and Estonia. So I need to go to these countries. It likely is a legacy of kind of distrust of market that comes out of the communist era. I don't know. I don't know these countries very well. And high trust because they're pretty small countries who have a pretty functional set of institutions. What is more interesting is Denmark versus the US. So actually Denmark is pretty trusting of market institutions. Well, they've got very different types of market institutions that are bolstered by a pretty a pretty fair, I don't know if it's meritocratic, but at least an education system that people perceive works a little better. So I think they have higher trust in the ability of being upwardly mobile. My favorite country, France, kind of gets the worst mix of attitudes here. They think there's a lot of freeloaders and they don't trust the market, okay? So why am I showing you this? Because basically the reason why I think the demand side is not reacting to growing inequality is because countries are in these, I would think of them as ideological ideal types. So the United States comes with a kind of set of beliefs and cultural traits that as inequality increases, doesn't make them very predisposed to redistributive policies. But differently, if you see inequality increase, the best kind of mix of beliefs in order to create a support for more redistribution is to be in the lower left quadrant, to be more like Latvia and Estonia. Because if you see inequality increases, you're more likely to think it's unfair. And you're more likely to want to tax to fund social solidarity because you think it's done fairly. Okay? Think about flex security, if you remember these policies from the 90s. It's a mix of let's liberalize the labor market, but compensate people who lose their job through very generous unemployment insurance policies. That is the Danish model. It's a model that presupposes trust in market institutions, but a high trust in that social solidarity is done fairly. That's the institutional equilibrium they're in. Bottom line, a lot of things that are happening on the demand side are actually very stable, because you can think of countries as in these kind of four ideal typical equilibria, the US, the Danish, the French, or the Latvian to some extent. And shocks to the income distribution are interpreted through these types of lenses. And there's only a specific mix that actually will trigger an increase in demand for redistribution. Most countries are not in that mix. So that's my answer to that. And it's all about fairness. Thank you.
Great. Leave that out there. I think it's a graph. Can you see it up there for our visual?
Sure.
Everyone can enjoy your y-axis and try to learn what it means over Vincent's comments.
Yeah.
So Vincent, Mauro. Vincent, you want to offer some responses?
Sure. So thank you so much for this opportunity to talk about this book that I really enjoyed. I'm going to talk about three things that I really liked about the book, among many, but those three in particular. And then I'm just in the spirit of what I think the book was trying to do. I'm going to talk about things to think about as you kind of move forward, not necessarily focus too much on any particular aspect of the book. So the first thing that I really liked is I think it was very kind of at its base, very eclectic approach to the study of inequality. And, you know, I think we're going to have a new issue in Democracy and Autocracy apps and newsletter coming out. And I think the basic argument I'm going to make is that the study of inequality is often very siloed. You know, and speaking as a political scientist, we've often kind of left kind of studying the determinants of economic inequalities to the economists. We've kind of left the sociological views of inequality to sociologists and many other different disciplines. But I think the book is saying in many ways that, you know, this is a very inherently political process, at least part of it, right? And the policies that we advance and the political decisions that we make in power affect inequality, right? So I think political science has a lot to say about inequality. But on the other hand, it's a very complex thing, right? We shouldn't say it's all political, it's all economic, it's all sociological. So I think it's imperative that we take very eclectic approach to studying inequality. And I think this book is a very good exemplary example of that, if I can just use two redundant words there. And there's lots of examples, you know, there's very kind of political economy type arguments and theory building. There's kind of very traditional economic view of determinants of inequality, but there's also more kind of qualitative approaches. And there's some that are kind of more steeped in sociological approaches, kind of looking at the role of race or sectionalism for inequality in the US in particular. All of this to kind of say that this is a good example of, I think, the work that should be doing on inequality. It should bring in a lot of different approaches, or else we're not going to understand such a complex phenomenon. I disagree with Noam. I think you did an exceptional job of putting American and comparative subfields in conversation with the other, and this is a very difficult thing to do. But, you know, within political science, and this is kind of obviously related to the previous point, but distinct within political science, we've often kind of had a very siloed view of or study of inequality in American politics subfield and comparative politics subfield, right? And my personal opinion is that American subfield has kind of been at the forefront, at least recently, in kind of studying inequality in political science. That doesn't mean comparative doesn't have a good kind of tradition on this, but a lot of work has been done in American politics, but we've often kind of not spoken. We've theory built it in American, theory built it in comparative. We've done empirical analysis on the American case or kind of comparative, but they don't really kind of mesh very well. And so I want to make the argument that the U.S. is not exceptional. You know, so many people are surprised to know that the U.S. taxation system is actually just as progressive as many European countries, if not most European countries. It starts off at a more unequal level, but it does redistribute a lot of income. So I don't think there's anything exceptional about the U.S., and I think we need to be able to speak to each other, and that makes for better theory building and theory testing as well. And I think this book is definitely really making that effort, and whether Noam is completely satisfied with that effort is another question. But you know, to be fair, there are times when splitting the U.S. and other comparative countries is necessary. We don't always have the data that we need to kind of make these comparisons. But I think the book does a good job when we couldn't do that, when we couldn't keep them together in empirical analysis, we're at least like using theories from American or comparative and vice versa to kind of speak to each other. I think also on the third point, there's some really great conceptual work in the volume. And I think back to some of my favorite edited volumes, they often, if not always, have kind of a very kind of conceptual contribution that kind of lasts a lot longer than the empirics often do in these books. And I think there's some really good conceptual work being done here. Charlotte's is a great example, I think. And also, I agree that Bartel's chapter in particular is also very good, kind of understanding political inequality, kind of looking at kind of differences between influence and congruence. So I commend Edit volume on that as well. I have a few things that I think we can think about, and I think they're a bit speculative. So they're meant to kind of raise some eyebrows or provoke some discussion. So
Yes.
leaving Charlotte's chapter aside, which I thought was brilliant, I found part 3 a lot less convincing than part 2. So part 3 is why should voters kind of change why should redistributive demands change as inequality changes. Part 2 is more about whether governments are responding to inequality in ways that kind of represent the interests of the majority. Granted, I'm a bit biased. I've always found the kind of the part 2 part like whether the response is not more interesting and more convincing. But the basic argument that we should kind of traditional kind of approaches is that we're kind of in a very simplistic way, we're in a democracy, higher levels of inequality, if they keep increasing, there should be a corresponding increase in the redistributive demands among the populace, right? And I think as Charlotte kind of alluded to, this isn't necessarily always happening. In fact, sometimes it's not moving, inequality is rising, but we don't see kind of a corresponding increase in redistributive demands. But I think we still want to tether almost everything in this little branch of literature to those basic tenets that we should expect to see that. But I think, and I do applaud Charlotte for kind of moving away from that, but I think we can go a lot deeper. And I just want to make kind of this stylistic argument. What if I told you that the demographics of developed countries were so fundamentally different when many of these classic models of redistribution were kind of created or made? There's absolutely no way that they should function in the same way. So, in the 1960s and 70s, when most of these models kind of derived from, the developed world had fairly healthy demographics. You could look at a population pyramid; it looked like a pyramid. There was, a small group of older generation, and then it kind of got bigger and bigger as it got younger, right? And if you look at a population pyramid today, basically any country in Europe, US, even Latin America, even parts of Asia, it's almost like the opposite, right? Or if it's not, then there's like a big hump in the middle. So basically, simply stated, populations are rapidly aging and our fertility rates are rapidly dropping. To further complicated matters, perhaps in a very long time, at least in modern times, unprecedentedly, this larger, older generation is concentrated, most of the income and wealth is concentrated in this group to an unprecedented rate. People under the age of 40, even under the age of 30, have such a small percentage of any given country's wealth. So I guess one thing I would ask is, if the largest portion of the population is older and the largest proportion of the population owns much of the wealth, would we expect to see it rising inequality, greater demand for redistribution? I would say we'd actually expect kind of the opposite, right? We want the bigger chunk, the majority wants to keep their wealth, right? So I think, and I don't, as far as I know, I could be wrong about this, I've never seen political scientists really actually take up demographics in this way and inequality in a serious manner. So I think we need to put on sociological hats for a second and think through that. I wanted to talk a little bit about political parties. I won't drown on this. If you know about my research interests, this is not surprising. But to my credit, political parties were featured prominently in the edited volume, so I should be able to talk about that. And I think for good reason, of course, is we along have kind of thought as in a democracy, political parties are kind of the great aggregator of demands, right? theoretically, if there's demands for redistribution, a political party might see these demands, think it's beneficial for them to advance redistribute policies in order to get votes or, strengthen kind of support for a political party. But there seems to be a really big tension today in the US and Europe that many political parties, some argue all political parties, I don't know, that might be a bit extreme, are not advancing the demands or interests of these kind of a large swath of the population, or even people that vote for and support these parties, right? And I think the Hacker, Pearson, and Zacher chapter is really tapping into this tension. And obviously, many of you haven't read it, but it's about kind of Democratic Party, Republican Party, and their kind of bases, urban versus rural, but they don't really seem to be coherently kind of responding to these interest groups through the policy. But I think they get this tension really great. But I think we really need to drive further on kind of understanding the inner lives of parties and the politics within political parties to really understand why political parties aren't responding. And, I'll try to I had a longer version, but I'll shorten this. But I think, we have in the US case, Democratic and Republican parties that kind of both have these very traditional establishment, corporation-driven wings of the political parties, and they often control who kind of, gets how the money is spent, who gets elected, or who gets selected in the party, what types of policies, and in order to understand why, a Democratic Party has become much less redistributed by its behavior, you really need to understand why, or the internal dynamics within the parties, both parties. So just to kind of tie a few of these things together very quickly. So getting back to kind of the previously demographic thing. So I guess I just have kind of a couple questions. Given a kind of a 25-year-old, 30-year-old, kind of living paycheck to paycheck, mostly probably will never be able to buy a house, maybe. They don't feel financially stable enough to have kids. Who are they going to vote for? It's not always clear in the current landscape. So in my home country of Canada, for the first time in many generations, if the polls are to be believed, a majority of voters under 30 or even 35, and a pretty significant majority, are going to cast their vote for the Conservative Party of Canada. A surprising percentage of Gen Z voters will cast their vote for Donald Trump this election. Many unions are not even endorsing the Democratic Party in this election, and they do internal polls, and something like 60% of rank and file union members support Donald Trump. And I mean, whether you think their decision making is right or wrong, it's not really the point. I guess the question I have kind of in a broad sense is, what in today's environment, what is a rational redistribute seeking voter even supposed to cast their vote for?
Fantastic. Thanks, Vincent. So Vincent was, I think, modeling how a Canadian apologizes, which is what we're doing today. This was, I'm going to criticize you because actually you are exceptional. And so that's a good truth. Gotcha. Well, this is really great. Lots on the table. Anybody like to chime in? You've all been sitting so patiently and politely before giving Charlie a chance to respond to Vincent's eyebrow raising provocation. Mark.
Based on the history, is there attention to, or should there be attention to the interaction of these different causal agents? I think some might be mechanisms, and some might be multi-sequencing, and probably to how
Since we don't have a microphone in the room, let me just, for people online, Mark's question was about interaction effects and whether or not this eclectic model, whether it be testing some might be mechanisms, some might matter in sequential ways, and maybe thinking in other ways about interactions among these different causal factors that you bring to the table.
Yeah. Do you want me to respond?
I think you could, if you want to, or if you want to take a minute to think about it. Well, that's up to you.
No, we've thought about it, and this was part of the kind of thinking about whether we wanted a concluding chapter, and we had an APSA sort of session with a bunch of critics, one of whom criticized the absence of a concluding chapter, and actually Larry Bartels was in the audience and pointed out that this literature is maybe 20 years old at this point, and I would say that's true for the politics of redistribution literature, not so much the sort of political inequality, which is even more recent. I think we're just not at the point where we know enough about which of these is the most important factor and how do they interact with each other, and which came first and was sort of what the sort of sequence is. So I think what we were hoping is to push us to put these things together and to try to think about what are the most important explanations and what are the sequences, which are the mechanisms, and which are the sort of decisive factors, and then to think about sort of how to test those things. But I think we wanted to push the literature in that direction rather than sort of say, at the end, what we think those sequences might be. And also, I think Jonas and I probably have different views on what those sequences might be. But I think that's the sort of the goal for pushing this literature forward. Yeah. Yeah, and maybe that's a place for the newsletter to sort of push on a little bit.
But I think it makes sense. The eclecticism is always, I think, nice, and it's for its own sake. But I think that just when you're talking about an outcome of this scale and of this scope and of this length of time and happening in this many places, it seems just sort of unfathomable that there's going to be a master explanation for this. And even, I would say, as someone who's interested in authoritarianism, this is not only just happening in democracies either, right? There are clearly changes in the global political economy that are leading to, authoritarian regimes are also becoming more unequal as well. So there is, I think, a certain, there's a certain, judiciousness and responsibility in sort of putting these things forward. And as Vincent said, the idea is to bring a lot of different things together that aren't usually in conversation. And so resolving that conversation is a very different kind of task than actually getting the conversation going in the first place. So I think that's another way to think about and then even in a sense, these interaction effects would also not be dispositive in the same sort of way as the test of these variables independently would be. You'd be in the same suit in a way, right?
Yeah.
What do you guys think about this demographic argument that Vincent made? It's really interesting, right? So if the idea, if I understand correctly, so if the idea is that we think the majority is poor, right? But in a sense, the bigger bulk of population is becoming old, and even if that bulk of the population isn't itself, most old people aren't rich. If wealthy people are concentrated within that age bulge, right? Then you're going to get this resistance to and these are the people who vote. These are the people who contribute. There's political power. I mean, your political power of wealth is multiplied if you also add to it age and the political skills and the lack of other things to do that get old people to be involved in politics, right? So what did you guys make? It's not one grand theory of everything, but it's a pretty good it's a pretty big theory. And take on.
No, I love it. I've been thinking about it, and so I think I'm going to defend models. Like, if you take a model seriously, it should make you realize what it's missing. And so it definitely doesn't capture. And so it's not the fault of the model. It's the person who brings that model to society where it doesn't apply. And so in that sense, models are important to clarify your assumptions and to make sure your theory is in terms of I am that. So
don't go all the way to Milton Friedman here, right? So what small step?
Sometimes. Well, he didn't care, really. Yeah, okay.
Well, there's other aspects of Milton Friedman.
So I have to think about this. And so you have to think about the social functions of wealth, because ultimately it is a wealth story, because these groups are not all income rich. And so there's two things where I think we still don't know what's happening. So it's the social function of wealth in the following way. In the US, it plays a role for insurance. And so if you take it away from people, they're screwed, right? It's where how they put their children through college. That's how they make sure their descendants don't fall down the income ladder. Like it's a huge bet on the future. It's their own mini welfare state. Versus in countries like Scandinavian countries or France, where you have a whole welfare state, wealth is about consumption. And I think it's easier to tax that. And the political opposition to it would be a little weaker. So that's one thought I've been having and trying to test. The other thing is there really a wealth effect with housing? I think there's an insurance effect, not in terms of they want less distribution, but it's hard to tax, right? Because it's their insurance. When you sell your house and you're faced with even more expensive housing, right? Like the only way you realize that wealth is if you change areas or states and so I always thought interesting to think about these issues, and I still haven't seen the paper that convinces me that there is a big kind of wealth effect, and maybe as a consumption effect. Like, how do you realize that wealth? Like, if you don't, I don't want to be taxed because I'm rich. Are people with expensive houses really experiencing it as I'm rich? I guess what I mean. So that's my kind of two thoughts.
They feel mortgage poor, in fact, right?
Yeah.
So they think they're right. Yeah, so it's the opposite. Right.
And I just wanted to answer, like, who should socioeconomically vulnerable people vote for? So if you think about these two positions.
Yeah.
So so you're talking about the absence of a radical imagining. And so to me, there are really conflicting signals from the system. On the one hand, government's actually really responsive. COVID, they poured so much money through the system. And now Macron lost power because he did that, something, the debt out of control or whatever. So the ways in which the system is extremely responsive, like COVID in a lot of rich countries went okay, quote unquote. I mean, it's all relative, but ultimately, even people who own clubs in Paris got paid by the government to not open their clubs. They did so, but on the other hand, they're not doing redistribution. I agree, but they're still kind of making sure people don't experience radical socioeconomic vulnerability, or it's concentrated on a minority that's disorganized. And then the absence of radical imaginaries. I think a lot of the radical imaginaries are the people who imagine a society that is truly global, or at least we would let refugees and immigrants come in and, use our resources and stuff. I think that for a lot of people, it hurts pulling resources in on yourself. That's what the debate is. When the debate used to be between, can capitalism work or not? That debate's gone. But there's still radical debate, but they're no longer of the type that can trigger the saliency of truly redistributive policy.
Well, also, we talked about earlier today, this notion like with populism and this idea, a lot of what drives populism is this idea that the system is rigged, right? Which in a way, when you're talking about fairness, got me thinking about this idea of is the system rigged or not? And I haven't read Kathy's chapter in this book, but I do know her big book. And one of the main takeaways I took from that book was that once people sort of feel that they're outside the reach of the welfare state anyway, the presumption is, even if I'm paying in, and even if they are dishing out, I'm not the kind of person who's going to benefit. I'm not the kind of person who would actually receive these benefits in the first place, right? So it really goes to the heart of what you're talking about, Charlotte, which is this like, well, do I expect to benefit? If you're going in with a sense, and if again media effects and the like make you think the system is rigged, then there's not a policy in the world, right? There's absolutely really nothing that you can do as a government say, oh, well, this will reach you because your presumption is the system is rigged against people like me.
Yeah.
And that's a kind of a lack of efficacy, which is just, it kind of just smothers. It's it's just an avalanche that wipes out all these things. Like, well, what if we do this policy in rural areas? What if we do this policy? If people don't think they're going to reach them anyway,
right?
There's no conversation, right?
Yeah. Which is one of the things that Vincent mentioned, the Hacker, Pearson, Zacher chapter. I mean, I think they lay out, and it's part of a larger research agenda that they had on interest groups, but they lay out this kind of, curious situation in the United States where the Democratic Party is pursuing economic policies that benefit rural voters,
right,
that don't vote for them,
right,
and the Republican Party pursues, socioeconomic policies that benefit people who live in cities that don't vote for them.
Democracy.
Right. So, and there's a whole sort of story about how interest groups kind of, sort of lead to those outcomes. But it is and getting back to the question of like, the U.S. as a case versus U.S. exceptionalism. I mean, I continue to think that it's useful to think of the U.S. as a case, but I think their chapter pretty strongly suggests that like there's something very weird and unique that's happening in American politics that doesn't quite travel. And it has to do with the level of affective polarization, the level of partisanship, the amount of money in the political system, the role of interest groups. Right? There's just a whole sort of ecosystem, political ecosystem that's a little bit different. That then you say like, why does the U.S. look different from Denmark? It's like, well, right.
Yeah, but so I want to push you guys a little bit on this. So all with you on this American exceptionalism question, right? But since we have two Latin Americanists on the panel and some in the audience, I want to ask about Latin American exceptionalism, right? Because one thing is here, like, what is this the same story? Because Latin America historically has just had such absolutely crushing, overwhelming levels of inequality, just truly crazy levels of inequality for a very, very long time, right? And in a way, the exception was, well, somehow democracy was taking root. Despite this was part of the puzzle of these new, these political economy models of, with inequality. So I just wondered, this was a talk, and the book is very focused on the European cases, right? You traveled from Latin America to Europe to sort of do this from your original home. Vincent still lives there. He's still very much in Latin America. So I just wonder if, as we move the lens, I mean, for a place with such extreme levels of inequality, do we have to think about it, differently? That long historical, like, is inequality a stock variable in the sense, like, just decades and decades and decades of inequality, what that does to people's sense of political efficacy, or, how do we think about these talks as we make the move to Latin America? And I think about both of you guys, I'm curious what your thoughts are. Vincent, what do you think? As a Latin American, Latin Americans reading this book, it's an interesting perspective, right?
So I've always been kind of taken aback by, we often place the U.S. with the Latin American countries because, if you look at baseline inequality, they look similar. And obviously, geographic, some similar colonial histories, although there's obviously some divergence there. But I believe that the U.S. Behaves more like a European country in terms of its taxation system and in its welfare state. If you think the welfare state is kind of limited in the U.S., you should see some of the Latin American welfare states that had traditionally and still remain today in many respects very truncated. So like they had very generous social programs, but they only were filtering to a very small segment of the population. So it's complicated because there is some sense of it is a stock variable in some sense. Actually, some people might be surprised to know that pre-Columbian Latin America was actually just as unequal, if not more unequal, than it was in when the Spanish took over and kind of extracted wealth. So these are things that come from very long histories. So, and we often kind of took little small snapshots and we think, oh, look, there's a bit of a change, but you have to look at the longer array. So I think I agree with ethos of this book in the sense that the US and Europe has a lot more to say with each other than necessarily Latin America. But that doesn't mean we can't use different regions and different theories from all over the world.
Yeah, I mean, to me, it's I've kind of spanned regions in this way, and partly because I do think it's the same question, right? I mean, Latin America starts with high levels of inequality, or at least starts at the moment of entering real electoral democracies with some amount of accountability, and those democracies fail to respond to demands, and the demands are high. I mean, it's not like people are, it's not like voters in Latin America are telling us, no, I don't trust the government, so I don't want the government to be involved in redistribution. And like, you don't get the U.S. American kinds of public opinion responses. Latin Americans want government intervention.
Yeah.
So, I do think there's a similar puzzle there. And, to the extent that it's hard to get Europeanists to think of the US or Americanists to think of Europe as sort of comparable cases, it's even harder to get either of them to think that their cases are in any way comparable to Latin America or Latin Americanists. But, I've said many times that, it's the sort of easy argument is these are weaker states, state capacity, they can't redistribute. Right. I think you can make that case for, some parts of the world and maybe some parts of Latin America. Yeah. But, Brazil engaged in like a massive redistributive program at the beginning of the 2000s and, raised millions of people out of poverty. So there are things, and, it's not, complete redistribution. It's, it's not Denmark, but there are things that those states are capable of that they are choosing not to do. And I think there's still a puzzle there about, why they choose not to do those things, or why voters let them get away with choosing not to do those things. And I think some of the same explanations that are in this volume help us to understand those things: the role of political parties, the role of interest groups, the role of race.
Yeah, I mean, India, we talk about Brazil, India as well. Again, these chronic problems of scale and scope and just the sheer number of people to reach. And yet, pretty amazing headway in certain anti-poverty programs, more than people would have expected, or that a pure state capacity argument would lead you to expect. So yeah, I think there's a lot of underperforming countries in welfare terms that we should probably show some of these positive examples of equalization. But maybe one way to think about this difference is the difference between like high inequality versus rising inequality. Yeah, right. And so that might be one way of thinking about, because the Swedens, the Denmarks, and the like, this is newly rising inequality probably have different political effects than just that chronic inequality. And in some ways, it might be the chronic inequality might give rise to a more left-wing populism, right? Because these very, very old inequalities that people are finally trying to break through, versus in the case of rising inequality, you're getting this right-wing populism where it gets scapegoating of immigrants and the like. So that might be one way to think about Europe and Latin America being different in the sense of that's one they capture part of the difference in the dynamics.
Yeah. Given that I have people who don't work on Europe only. So can you tell me if you agree with the following intuition? I have to teach Intro to American Politics with a French accent to American undergrad. So as a result, I've looked into the American political
totally.
Totally. Good. But so I think the thing I got out of it that I didn't totally fully realize that is a problem for comparing the US to Europe. And even though I have the United States in my research, and I never treat it as unique, makes America exceptional. It's this form of federalism. Because the what Tocqueville thought was impressive, this hyper local democracy, has huge effect on the educational system, on policing and housing market, in a way that even federal states like Germany, ultimately, it is the state that is in charge of raising revenue and that allocates it in a pretty centralized way. And America is totally decentralized, and you've got these elected officials that constantly can veto stuff. Yeah. And I do wonder, first of all, it makes data aggregation. So what are we comparing? Like your property tax in Ann Arbor is a pretty intense wealth tax, right? But there are other parts that pay nothing. And so, of course, on aggregate, it balances out. And so to what extent we're capturing the extent to which there is a wealth tax in the US, And then once it's hard to compare exactly what's going in the US. And this federalism is crazy to me. So if there's somewhere else in the world where the brand of federalism that they have has this kind of local level ability of raising taxes for very important public good that shapes people's lives to such an extent.
So I'm thinking about Canada. right? So how much does Canada reflect this or look different from this?
Somewhat similar.
Somewhat similar.
A little more centralized at the federal level, but
Right.
definitely have those three levels present and a lot of legal ways and a lot of property tax at the local.
So that, I mean, is there a good book or a dissertation that explains why didn't balloon? We're going to get the kind of intense stream outcomes of the maybe less people.
Already moving that way already.
Well, there are,
Yeah.
I mean, there are, the other federal cases in the Americas, Brazil, Mexico, Argentina. I mean, the redistributive programs are decentralized, but they're nationally
Managed.
funded.
Yes, and funded.
And that's
Yeah,
the case for Canada too, right? So
that's what
the
I
US
That's
is
what I taught. So please tell me.
unusual. But I guess, I mean, my usual sort of view on this is that those decisions were all choices that were based, political choices. The decision to decentralize in the particular way that the US has, institutionalized decentralization, was a response to rising demands for redistribution and a very sort of a political project to thwart efforts to do those things that other places didn't engage in, right? And so that just changes what we're asking, right? We're still asking the same question, but now the institution is the mechanism by which the sort of anti-redistributive forces sort of won that battle, but it's still sort of.
But they're very good at keeping
I
things
think the
fixed,
same
right?
question.
Anyway.
Yeah, but again, I mean, I think those things reproduce in a particular way that.
You can put things politely too. It's not just Vincent. There's a lot of ugly history put in a very delicate
Yes,
way.
a lot of ugly history. Yeah.
Indeed.
Yeah, thank you. My question is for Charlotte. I'm looking at this graph, and I also just want to say I felt today like I understood economics. So that was really nice. So whatever you've taught your students in Intro to American Politics, they've got some right answers. I hope I'm not reading this wrong, but I'm kind of curious about what's going on. Is that China in the middle?
No. This
that's
is Czech
Switzerland.
Republic. Which one
No,
are you looking at? Oh, yeah,
Switzerland.
It's all Europe.
Yeah.
I would
yeah.
not.
Yes.
No. So I
The
only.
Swiss are misleading.
It did feel like an outlier based on what I thought.
No. It's all
Swiss are always neutral, right in the middle.
It's impossible. I don't know. I could ever bring China there. I don't know the country, but yeah, Switzerland. But actually, weird brand of federalism, exactly as the U.S.
Sure.
Great comparison.
Yeah.
And most of those projects, most of those redistributive schemes are privatized.
Yeah.
And so, can I just ask, like, what is going on exactly with the UK? Is that GB is UK, right?
Yeah.
And so you're seeing high or higher, moderate to higher levels of trust in the market, and then high free riding, like perspective.
Yeah. So the UK is a case where, and you should think of it as they're pretty divided on how to think about the market. There's still some legacies of kind of, the middle class versus the workers type. And it's been pretty stable over time. So they're not like the US, a little further down, but still they're more than the French, for instance. And then when it comes to social solidarity, it's crumbled. That's one of these cases where things have changed.
So my question was, is this before or after Brexit?
So this is before. This is 2009. Post Brexit, things have recovered a little bit, but it's polarized and it's become tied to immigration. So this is not tied to immigration, these measures. So basically, it's not about. So I always before Brexit, the welfare queen was white in the UK. It was a white mother who had 4 kids. Like there's been some studies of that are interesting by Larson that actually goes and looks at skin color. Lately, I think the Romas are getting a lot of the hit, like the kind of racialized perceptions of free riders. That's what you see more now.
And is that like any welfare generally, or is this also like mostly driven by like NHS stuff?
So these items, again, I had to rely on historical data. I would have answered differently, of course, but you should think of it as perceptions of free riding for able-bodied folks who are not working. Right. Mm-hmm. This is what I'm plotting. For the NHS, I've got other questions. I ask even about smokers, to what extent should people are responsible for their. And so I can't place countries, but at the individual level, I'm seeing similar stuff happening and how people think about smokers as deserving or not.
So we're at 5:20, and you guys have put in a long day. So this is really been a great conversation. I want to thank Zaire and Rosa for all the help they had in putting this together. Yes. Thank you all for coming out on this beautiful day. It's great to have a good audience here for this whole discussion. So Noam, Lupu, Cavaille, Vincent, Mauro, thanks so much.
Thank you.